Is that from a security perspective, given your background on that and on counterterrorism and some of these other issues, you have special insight into this?
Yes, and I think the backdrop to this is that there's really a geopolitical context to all of this, and we have to make sure that we're not losing the forest for the trees. The geopolitical backdrop is that around the world there is now, I don't know if it's a race, but there's certainly a march towards finding alternative ways for new digital financial infrastructure. Basically, how to do cross-border transactions in a way where you're not relying the same way on traditional banking infrastructure. That's happening, whether we want to like it or not. And it's not just China. Of course, China has its project, but other countries in the EU, the UK, Japan, other parts of East Asia are all trying to figure out a way to innovate with payments. Now, the geopolitical implication there is if there is an alternative financial infrastructure, if there are new rails and the U.S. doesn't have the same influence on that, it is not sort of at the table when new standards are being laid, then that impacts U.S. economic statecraft. Sanctions, the ability to sanctions, the potency of our sanctions power comes from the centrality of the U.S. to the financial global infrastructure. So if that shifts, even if it shifts a little bit, doesn't mean that China is going to take over or that the yuan is going to displace the dollar. But if there's a viable new rail where sanctioned actors can now transact, that's trouble.
And the reason is that if you look at Americans, 80% of them feel like the current financial system doesn't work for them. You know, the fees are too high, the delays are there, it doesn't serve everybody equally. And it's not surprising, by the way. You know, the current financial system is built on 40-year-old technology. Some of the laws have been around for 100 years before the internet even existed. And so, you know, my belief is that cryptocurrency is actually the most important technology that can help update the financial system. And what's really cool to see is that actually the user base of crypto, you know, advocates out there, there's 1 in 5 households in the U.S. are now using crypto. They're actually coming together and starting to get organized and saying, we want to elect candidates across 435 congressional districts that will help create this industry here in America safely.
Do you think realistically we are closer to regulation? Becky and I and Joe were talking about this earlier. And, you know, it feels like we're closer, but also feels like maybe we're just as behind as we were 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I've been spending more and more time in D.C., and what's great to see is that there is strong bipartisan support for legislation. I think everybody saw what happened with FTX, and they said, OK, we need to make sure there's strong consumer protection. We also recognize that there's innovation potential here, and we don't want this to be like 5G or something like that, you know, the semiconductor industry that got moved offshore too much. We need this to be built here in America with strong consumer protection. So there's at least 3 different groups I'm aware of in D.C., senators that are working on different bills being drafted in various different forms. And, you know, it takes a small miracle anytime something actually becomes law. But I'm excited to see that there's people who are passionate about that, making that happen. And I think the voters in America want to see that. They're going to elect candidates coming up who are going to advocate for that.
So what do you tell the crypto critics? And I'm thinking Senator Elizabeth Warren, she has said the following. She says, we have money laundering rules that cover banks and credit unions and stockbrokers and gold dealers and even Western Union, but current rules don't cover big parts of the crypto industry, and crypto likes it that way. Is she right?
No, that's just simply not true. I mean, Coinbase is a great example of this. I started this company more than 10 years ago now. And I started it in the United States for a reason. I believed that this needed to be built here in a compliant and regulated way. So we've actually been regulated for about 10 years now. I mean, we initially sought out money transmission licenses here in the U.S. because that was the closest thing we could find to a license that made sense. We've since gone beyond that. I mean, we got one of the first BIT licenses in New York. We're regulated by the CFTC, a federal regulator here. We registered with FinCEN. And by the way, that's just in America. So the U.S. risks really being left behind here a little bit. You know, the rest of the world is actually moving and trying to draw crypto companies in. You know, London and Singapore and Hong Kong and the financial hubs of the world are saying we want crypto to be built here. Europe just passed comprehensive crypto legislation. And so the U.S. really risks falling behind.
What do you say?
I think new legislation is needed. And the reason is that if you look at Americans,